I'd like to invite you to turn with me in your Bibles to the 19th chapter of the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 19. I will read the first 8 verses of this chapter as we're continuing in this series that I began a few weeks ago called The Old Testament in 12 Verses. We continue today with this passage, Exodus 19, 1-8, focusing particularly on verse 5, 5 and 6, but let us hear the word of the Lord this morning from Exodus chapter 19. On the third new moon after the Israelites had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They had journeyed from Rephidim, entered the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness. Israel camped there in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites." So Moses came, summoned the elders of the people, and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. The people all answered as one, "Everything that the Lord has spoken to us, we will do." Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God for his word today. Well, I'd like to begin by asking you a question, and if you'd like to throw out an answer verbally, I would welcome you to do that. If someone were to ask you, what's the difference between the way that people enter into salvation in the Old Testament versus the New Testament? How are people saved, walk with the Lord in the Old Testament versus how they experience salvation in the New Testament? What do you think you would say? Animal sacrifice in the Old and faith in the New. Thanks, Merle. Thank you. Other ideas, other thoughts? Yes, in the Old Testament, you had to provide your own sacrifice. In the New Testament, it's done for us. Thank you, Judy. Other ideas? Had to be repeated in the Old Testament and not in the New. Any other thoughts on this? Pardon me, Shirley? Both have to do with faith, yeah. So, yeah. Well, for a long time in my life, if someone would have asked me that question, I think I probably would have said something along the lines of, in the Old Testament, they were saved by following the law. In the New Testament, we're saved by grace, through faith in the sacrifice of the death of Christ on the cross for our sins. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like a reasonable answer to this to you? Yeah, I see some nodding heads. That in the Old Testament, we're saved by keeping the law. In the New Testament, we're saved by grace. That's probably the way that I would have summarized it for a lot of my life. But and by the way, did you happen to notice when does the law begin to be given in the Old Testament? Anyone know where the first recording of the 10 Commandments is given, say? Exodus 20. There you go. Kind of the next chapter after this one, right? So, yeah. So it seems that if my answer that I formerly probably might have given was correct, then you'd have to say that all the people who lived prior to Exodus 20 were either not saved or were saved by some other means, or that they died in their sins. At least they were saved by something other than keeping the law. If the law wasn't given until Exodus 20, there's many centuries of history of people who lived prior to the giving of the law. We're into the third of the 12 verses, really passages of the Old Testament that are being set forth in this series as a way of familiarizing ourselves with this big section of our Bible, the first 39 books of it. This series is meant as a way of kind of befriending this part of our Bibles by seeing what's most important in it, so that we can put all the rest of the Old Testament into perspective based on these foundational passages and portions and the truths that are taught there. So we looked a few weeks ago in the first sermon of this series at Genesis chapter 12, 1-3, the calling of 75-year-old Abraham from his home, from his father's house, from all that was familiar to him, to an unknown land that God said he would promise to show him. And along with this stark imperative, Abram, go, God accompanied that act of obedience on Abram's part with a series of extravagant promises, really, not only to give him that land that he would show him, but to bless him, to make his name great, to give him and his barren wife many descendants, and that those descendants and all of Abram's family would be blessed and would be a blessing to the entire world. Pretty amazing stuff. God saves Abraham and Sarah and their family after them many centuries before the giving of the law. They enter into God's salvation and God's strategy for blessing and saving the world by believing God's promise and by beginning to walk with God. As Shirley said, it's by faith in both Old and New Testaments. Exodus 3, 1-15, which we looked at a couple of weeks ago, focusing particularly on Exodus 3, verse 7, was the story of Moses' encounter with God at the burning bush and what God spoke to him there, telling Moses that he who identified himself as the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the ancestors of Moses, had seen the misery and had heard the cries of the Israelite people who were in bondage under the military and political might of the empire of Pharaoh, the most powerful country on earth in that day. God knows their suffering, he says. He has seen it. He has felt it. He knows it intimately. And he has come to rescue them, to deliver them, to save them. What? To save them before the giving of the law? Yes. In fact, this greatest act of salvation in the entire Old Testament, the act that gives this book its name, the act that reverberates all through the rest of the entire Bible with echo after echo after echo resounding down right to this very day, the echo of the Exodus takes place before the giving of the law. God keeps his promises that he makes to Moses, this most reluctant partner in ministry. He is with Moses every step of the way, and as he promised to bring Moses and the people of Israel back to this very mountain where he first met him in the burning bush, well, here they are. Excuse me. Well, so much for my theory that people in the Old Testament are saved by keeping the law. This theory comes to ruin on verses 4-6 of this beautiful passage. And if we could read them again. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. I have saved you, Israel. I've saved you from bondage under this foreign power. And now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words you shall speak to the Israelites, God says. Now, if you are a person who thinks like I have shared that I used to think about these matters, you might be inclined to argue that verses 5 and 6 prove the point, and that at least from this point forward, Israel does indeed live and remain in God's grace by keeping the law. But that begs the question, how did they get into and under God's grace again, so as to be able to remain in and under it? Right, by God's free grace, by God's choosing them, saving them, bringing them into covenant relationship with himself. That's what he's saying to them here through Moses. My dear people, I have delivered you from Egypt and brought you as if on mighty eagle's wings to myself, to this place of meeting. And here we are. Egypt's gods have proven powerless against me, the one true God. And by delivering you from them, I have staked my claim on you, on your allegiance, your worship, your service. So now come, people, listen to me, obey my voice, accept the covenant I'm making with you now, and live in faithfulness to this covenant. This is, as commentator Terence Fretheim puts it, a wonderfully gracious image of God as a mother who cares for her young during that time when they are especially vulnerable. They can find refuge from the threats of life under the shadow of her wings. God has saved them and has been a refuge to them. And, of course, therefore is now stated in verse 5. The goal of the Exodus was not some kind of self-governing freedom for Israel, but like all freedom in this world, it's not a freedom to do what we want. Paul says that quite clearly in the New Testament, that the freedom that we think we have to do whatever we want is actually a freedom that takes us right back into bondage before you can snap your fingers, because that so-called fictional freedom to just do whatever you want is the devil's most pernicious lie, that this would be the way that we would experience freedom, is the freedom to do whatever we want. No, there is no such freedom as that. The freedom that we have is a freedom to serve God and to embody God's character as he is telling them to do now before the other and surrounding nations. In light of this saving miracle of God's grace, there is an appropriate response. What is that appropriate response? Obey my voice and keep my covenant. And then 3 new elements, which are consequences of this decision, are described and provided. First of all, he says, you will be my special possession, my treasure among all the nations of the world. Israel, you will be my most treasured possession. Secondly, you will be for me a kingdom of priests. And thirdly, you will be my holy nation. That's what he says in the latter part of verse 5 and 6. And right in the middle of that, between telling them that they shall be his treasured possession and telling them that they shall be a kingdom of priests, there is this phrase, all the earth is mine, God says. And that seems to place all of these other things into perspective. All of the earth is mine, and because all of the earth is mine, God says, I want you to be my treasured possession, who will be my royal priesthood and who will be my holy nation. This call for Israel to give God their loyalty and their obedience is set within the framework of his claim upon all of the earth, that there is no part of this world and no people and no nation who do not belong to God. Because all the earth is mine, so you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So this suggests that all of these 3 phrases, being a treasured possession, being a royal priesthood, being a holy nation, relate to this claim that God makes upon the entire earth. They will be God's special possession, a special people from among all the nations who belong to God and whom God can henceforth call into action on his behalf, to be the bearer of his purpose of salvation for the nations. They will be, he says, a kingdom of priests. Well, what on earth would that mean? The priests of Israel were a group of people who served the rest of the nation, served by being mediators who would help the people to build their relationship with God. And now God is saying, I want you as a nation to take that servant role, not a ruling kind of role, not a dominating kind of role among the nations of the earth, but a serving role, serving to help mediate the relationship that I want to have with the people of all nations. So he's calling them to this role as mediators, as people who help to facilitate a relationship between God and others. And he says, you'll be for me a holy nation, a people set apart not just from the other peoples, but for a specific purpose, to embody God's own holy purposes in the world and to embody God's own holy character in the world. Well, as I've told you before, the series on which this is the book on which this series is based is a book called The Old Testament in 12 Verses. The chapter that focuses on this passage this morning is written by a lady named Jennifer Matheny, who teaches Old Testament at Nazarene Theological Seminary. And she's the one who suggested the title for this sermon, DTR. Anybody know what DTR means? David Thompson Resort. I have heard that for some urban slang, it's down to ride, meaning, yeah, I'm down to go with wherever you guys are going to go have a good time. Sure, I'm on the list. Put me on the list. But the most common expression of what DTR means, according to the Urban Dictionary, is define the relationship. She describes going on a campus tour of a college in California where her daughter was considering attending. And the tour guide directed us to the DTR spot on campus, which was next to a beautiful pond. And here couples would sit on a bench and have the talk, defining their relationship. Have we moved beyond the point of just being friends over into something more, into romantic, committed relationships? This bench, the DTR bench, is a place where hearts pound and hearts flutter and stomachs do flip-flops. I remember the opening months and couple of years of my relationship with Judy very well. Back in 1984 at Mountain View Bible College in Didsbury, we met for the first time, and our primary thing that brought us together in that time was music. We were both on a part of a small music team that was getting trained and prepared to go out and represent the college in churches on weekends. Both of us were in romantic relationships with other people, but we were thrown into close quarters a lot throughout that first year, driving in vans from place to place across Alberta, and after the school year was over, driving down into the Pacific Northwest, spending many, many hours on the road together. And we had this opportunity to begin our relationship as a friendship that didn't have any kind of romantic content to it whatsoever. But over that summer of the year between my first and second years in college, the other relationships that we were in kind of came to an end. And so in September of that year, we come back to college, and I remember having some DTR talks throughout September and October and November. Are we wanting to be more than just friends? We cared a lot for each other, but as Judy said to me a few times, I'm kind of afraid that if we move beyond just friendship into a romantic relationship and then that doesn't work out, then will we be able to be friends anymore? Well, finally, by about December, we said, we'll take the chance. We'll take the risk. And our relationship with the DTR talk moved beyond friendship into romance, which has continued to contain a very strong element of friendship and treasuring all through these years. But this raises the question, as Israel and God are here at the foot of Mount Sinai having their DTR talk, defining the relationship, God asking Israel to become his committed partner in covenant relationship. It asks the question of us, how do we define the relationship that we have with God? Have you accepted the offer of covenant relationship that he makes to you? Are you walking faithfully in it? Has it gotten stale and old and predictable? Has your heart been led astray into other relationships with competitors, as Israel's heart often was? Notice that God does not say, if you keep my law, if you obey my rules, then good things happen. What does he say? If you will obey my voice. This is very personal and really quite open-ended. It's very different from obeying this abstract body of laws full of legalese that keep you scratching your head and wondering what on earth that means. The phrase, the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, kind of brings to mind what I'm talking about here. Reminds me, again, of another memory from those Bible college years. When I first arrived at Mountain View Bible College, I was handed a student handbook, i.e. the rule book. And I remember the first time reading through all of these rules, and I'm like, there's no way, I can't be here. I can't live under all these stupid rules. But then I remember there being a meeting with the dean of students in which the spirit of the law for the college was set forth. And I realized that it was all really quite doable and indeed even reasonable, though there might have been a time or two when I still snuck out after curfew. Might have even hockey sticked the door of the resident assistant's closed so he couldn't get out and catch us. Or not, who knows? My memory is kind of fuzzy. Yeah, it was probably someone else who did that, not me. God calls us to obey his voice. That implies living in a posture of listening, being inspired and empowered by the listening. He calls us into a covenant, and that implies a very special kind of relationship, like a happy marriage in which the partners delight in each other and love to please each other. It's all very personal. And then he says, because we, you, my people, and I, are partners in personal covenant relationship with one another, we'll participate together in shared mission as well. You'll be involved in my work. You'll be a kingdom of priests. The whole purpose of your existence as a people will be wrapped up in being mediators, being bridges that form a link between people that don't know me and me. You'll be a holy nation, a nation that demonstrates and lives out God's holy ways in this world, so that people can experience God's holiness and see it lived out in ways that they can understand. And by the way, just in case you and I might be thinking that was for them, what about us? Well, listen to these words from 1 Peter 2, 9 and 10, written to New Testament Christians, believers in Jesus Christ, folks like you and I. Peter says, and listen for the echoes of Exodus 19, You are a chosen people. You are royal priests. You are a holy nation. You are God's very own possession. All three of those last phrases are direct quotes, really, from Exodus 19. As a result, Peter says, you can show others the goodness of God, for he has called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Well, bringing it down a little bit to everyday life, what might it mean to be your neighbor's priest? I think being a priest has kind of gotten a bad rap in our time, in our Protestant ways. We don't talk about people being priests. You don't call me a priest. It's just kind of not a way of thinking that we enter into very much. But if we think of it as a bridge builder, what might it mean to be your unbelieving family member's priest? What might it mean to be a priest to your lost and confused grandchild? Remember, the role of a priest is to find a way to mediate a relationship between that person and God. And I think one absolutely essential quality of a mediator is that you have to be trustworthy. No one is going to let you close enough to try and mediate a relationship between them and God if they don't trust you. And so I would suggest that it is an essential act of a priest to be a good listener, to ask good questions, to show genuine interest in that person. Not just listening enough to try to get your point across, but listening so as to understand and empathize and show them a holy and self-giving love as God has done for us. A priest has a servant heart and an attitude, not a know-it-all and told you so attitude. Most of all, a priest in the service of God is a person who loves people, is willing to go a long way out of their way to build a bridge that someone else can walk across to experience God's saving grace. I'd like to close this message by actually showing you a testimony of a young man named Marvin who experienced salvation through the priestly ministry of actually this lady who is going to be speaking in our camp next week, Pastor Jenny Noriega. Her ministry to a young man named Marvin who was on the streets and going nowhere good has led to an amazing transformation in his life. And I'd like to play his story for you now. I hope you'll be able to hear. He speaks with something of an accent, of course, so I'm hoping that you'll be able to hear what he's saying. Let's listen now to Marvin's testimony. Oh yeah, sharing sound. Good call, Jude. Here we go.
I was running from house to house. The cops were kicking in doors trying to find me. I was living on the streets. I grew up in the inner city. My mom abandoned me when I was young, so it always just been me and my pops. My pops' relationship was hard. He was physically and mentally abusive. That did a lot to me. As a freshman in high school, I was skipping classes, smoking weed, and popping pills. I was just nowhere near God, and I didn't know anything about God. My friend kept inviting me to church and youth group, and I will always say no. I was walking on the plaza with some friends one night, up to no good. When Pastor Jenny pulled up, she asked if we wanted to get in and go get some ice cream. She seemed open and nice, so I decided to go. I was coming to youth group in Pastor Jenny's living room every now and then. Something felt different there. It was peaceful. I was finding my way with these new friends, but I still found myself getting in trouble. I felt like I was always ready for something to pop off. Me and my homeboys would never sleep, just wait for something to happen. 2 days before New Year's Eve, I got shot up. I didn't want to live like that anymore. I said, I'm not going out for New Year's Eve with my friends. I'm going to go to Pastor Jenny's house. My friends thought I was crazy. I got saved that night, 12:01 January 1st, 2020. I felt God calling me to more, the old me and the new creation. It was unreal, man. I was so locked into God, but it still wasn't easy. I found myself kicked out of my house and running around with the same friends on the streets. Cold and hunger had robbed people to make ends meet. The cops had been looking for me and I had 2 warrants out for my arrest. I got caught and I was taken to jail. I was facing a 10 to life sentence. Going to jail showed me there weren't that many people there for me. Pastor Jenny was there and had called my legal counsel to help with my case. While sitting in jail, I started to read the Bible and pray. I knew God was calling me out of this life into a new one. I wanted to tell people about him and how he had changed my heart, and I was called into full-time ministry while sitting in my cell. After 27 days in jail, I was released on house arrest. Pastor Jenny had done so much to help get my charges dropped. I remember when we found out the charges were going to be dropped, I got off the phone with Pastor Jenny and started crying. I felt blessed to have all my charges cleared, to have a chance at a new life. Over the course of a year, my dad recommitted his life to the Lord and started coming to church. It has helped our relationship a lot. I serve on a worship team and help Pastor Jenny with the discipleship group on Mondays. I serve on the board and I am on staff at Total Life Church of the Nazarene. I'm also taking classes at the Nazarene Bible College to become a pastor. I know there are people looking for hope, just like me and even worse. I know there are others in my community, people that need to know there's more.